For decades, there has been a persistent myth in science, the idea of a God spot. The assumption is that somewhere inside the human skull, there is a single, isolated cluster of neurons responsible for generating profound spiritual and transcendent experiences. Modern neurobiology has completely dismantled that idea. Instead of isolated centers, the brain operates through dynamic, systems-level networks. Whether a person is entering a state of deep nanitation, experiencing a religious trance, or engaging in highly divergent creative thinking, these cognitive phenomena rely on the same observable, mechanical pathways. To understand how these altered states of consciousness occur, we have to build a biological model of them from the bottom up. This requires mapping the brain's large-scale functional networks, tracking specific regional cortical dynamics, and looking deep below the cortex to the autonomic nervous system. This systems-level approach maps the specific, mathematically precise biological architecture required for human transcendence. The foundational challenge in studying altered states is methodological. How do you objectively measure a deeply subjective internal experience without disrupting the person having it? Historically, researchers relied heavily on electroencephalography, or EEG. This apparatus captures the real-time electrical language of the brain by recording rapid cortical oscillations. But EEG has a severe limitation. It possesses excellent temporal resolution, meaning it records exactly when an event happens down to the millisecond, but its spatial resolution is poor. The exact origin of the electrical activity remains ambiguous. To solve this spatial problem, researchers turned to functional imaging modalities like SPECT and fMRI. These techniques track cerebral blood flow and metabolism. When neurons fire, they consume oxygen and glucose, allowing scientists to create a precise geographic map of metabolic demand inside the brain during a specific task. The two methodologies offer opposing advantages. One dictates the exact timing of a cognitive shift, while the other identifies the specific structural location of that activation. Only by synthesizing the precise timing of electrical shifts with deep spatial geography can researchers begin to decode the hidden mechanics of an altered state. With the measurements in place, the focus shifts to the structures themselves, beginning with the brain's macro-level networks. This diagram shows the default mode network, or DMN. It spans the medial prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, and medial temporal lobes. This is the brain's baseline system, primarily governing self-referential thought and passive mind-wandering. It operates in an inverse relationship with the executive control network, or ECN, located in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The ECN activates during focused, external, or goal-oriented tasks. When one turns on, the other typically turns off. So how do these networks behave during an intense religious practice, like stationary prayer, which appears entirely passive from the outside? Imaging data gathered during deep stationary Islamic prayer shows a strict decrease in default mode network activity. Because the DMN is defined as the network that decreases during a cognitive task, this suppression proves that prayer is a highly focused, active neurocognitive process. It overrides the brain's natural tendency to wander. Data on eminent creative thinkers reveals a different pattern. They exhibit an unusual ability to flexibly co-activate both the DMN and the ECN simultaneously during idea generation. These departures from the brain's standard competitive network arrangement, whether through absolute suppression or unusual co-activation, are the defining signatures of an altered state. Below the scale of entire networks, specific regional structures govern the distinct physical sensations of these states. We start with the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the initiator of willful acts. During concentration practices, it drives the sustained, intense attention required to hold a single focus. Meanwhile, toward the back of the brain is the posterior superior parietal lobule, or PSPL. This region's critical function is spatial navigation. The PSPL constantly receives incoming sensory data to draw the physical boundary between your body and the external world, ensuring you don't bump into objects. This brings us to a biological mechanism called deafferentation, the active neurological blocking of sensory input to a specific structure. When sensory data is severed, the PSPL has no information to process. Deprived of spatial coordinates, the lobe fails to find the physical edge of the body. The brain is forced to interpret this absence of boundaries as a sensation of infinite space, or absolute oneness. This is a direct result of the prefrontal cortex. The intense, sustained attention initiated in the frontal lobe is the exact trigger that forces this sensory gating in the parietal lobe. Subjective feelings of unity with the universe are the direct, observable result of targeted regional sensory deprivation. Moving deeper, below the cortex, we look at the brainstem and hypothalamus to examine the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic baseline is a constant push and pull between two opposing evolutionary forces. On one side is the ergotropic, or sympathetic system. This is responsible for energy expenditure, extreme alertness, and the fight-or-flight response. On the other side is the trophotropic, or parasympathetic system. This system governs energy conservation, baseline metabolism, and profound physiological rest. During intense stationary practice, the trophotropic system is driven to its absolute maximum capacity. At that point, it hits a hard biological threshold. This triggers a paradoxical mechanism known as spillover. Reaching maximum capacity in one regulatory system forces a sudden explosive activation of the opposing system. The physiological result is immediate. The individual experiences profound oceanic stillness, simultaneously paired with an immense ecstatic release of cognitive energy. The most extreme and paradoxical states of consciousness are achieved by intentionally pushing the brain's baseline regulatory safety mechanisms past their breaking point. We can now map the complete biological cascade required to achieve an altered state. Willful attention alters the balance of functional networks. That shift forces regional deafferentin in the parietal lobe, which ultimately triggers a subcortical autonomic spillover. This biological architecture suggests that the brain's own structural mechanics are what define our perception of reality. The brain does not act as a passive filter, merely receiving an objective external reality. Instead, its functional limits dictate what we perceive as real, boundless, or transcendent. Whether an experience is defined as deeply meditative, highly creative, or intensely spiritual, it relies on this exact, observable neurofunctional architecture.